She thought it was just a routine tree removal, but one strike of the excavator uncovered something that had been hidden underground for decades. When the workers cleared the pit completely, everyone was shocked by what they saw. Subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. For most of her adult life, Marlene had moved through her days with the quiet perseverance of someone who had long ago accepted that the world did not intend to make anything easy for her. She was in her early 40s, a dark-skinned single mother with tired hands and a resolute posture, a woman who carried both exhaustion and dignity in equal measure. Her job at the local elementary school was not glamorous, nor did it offer much in the way of financial comfort, but it provided steady hours, a reasonably predictable schedule, and enough security to make sure her son never went to bed hungry. As the assistant to the school administrator, she spent most of her time sorting files, answering calls, organizing schedules, and navigating the endless small crises of teachers and parents. It was the kind of job that kept the world running while ensuring that no one ever remembered the name of the person actually doing the work. Her financial life was a constant balancing act. The first of each month came with bills spaced so closely together that she sometimes felt suffocated by numbers. Rent had once been her largest burden, until she finally managed to take out an affordable mortgage on an older house at the edge of the neighborhood, a quiet place built in the early 1960s when everything from paranoia to optimism had shaped the architecture. The house had its quirks: creaking floors, outdated wiring, windows that let in too much cold in winter and too much heat in summer. But it was her home, her one anchor, and she poured into it what she could, even if that meant repainting a wall herself instead of hiring someone, or fixing small things with improvised tools rather than paying for a professional. The backyard, however, was another matter entirely. It had been a problem since the day she moved in. At first glance, it looked like the kind of place that had once held potential, a place where a family might have grown tomatoes or placed a picnic table, a spot where children might have played tag or an old man might have sat in the evenings enjoying a breeze after a long day. But decades of neglect had transformed that space into something almost unwelcoming. A dead tree towered above everything else, its lifeless branches clawing at the air like skeletal fingers. Its thick, gnarled roots had ruptured the concrete pathway and threatened the old drainage system. The remnants of a wooden shed leaned to one side, its boards softened and warped by moisture and time, as its roof half collapsed and covered in moss. Weeds sprouted in chaotic patterns, filling the gaps where grass had once grown. In some corners, the soil had eroded so unevenly that even walking across the yard felt like crossing a patch of abandoned land. For years, Marlene avoided thinking about the backyard more than necessary. She kept her focus on the house interior, on her son's school expenses, on the day-to-day responsibilities that always seemed more urgent. Still, every time she passed the kitchen window and looked out into that wild, neglected space, she felt the same tightness in her chest. She imagined turning it into something simple but decent. A place her son could play without risk of stepping on a rusty nail or tripping over a buried root. A place where she could sit outside after work with a cup of tea, listening to the faint hum of neighborhood life. That dream stayed with her, even when circumstances forced her to delay it again and again. It took her almost 4 years to save enough for what she considered the first real step. The dead tree had to be removed. The old foundation of the collapsed shed needed to be excavated. The soil required leveling. She didn't think about anything more ambitious. No patio, no garden, not even new grass. She only wanted the yard safe and cleared of hazards. When she finally felt ready, she began researching local contractors, comparing prices, reading reviews, and calling around on her lunch breaks. Most companies quoted her prices far outside her budget, but eventually she found a small independent crew willing to take on the work at a rate she could manage. After a simple meeting in her driveway with the owner, a contract was drafted. It listed the job as a removal of one large dead tree, demolition of remaining shed debris, and basic ground clearing. Estimated time, 1 day. Estimated cost, something she could swallow without losing sleep. The morning the crew arrived, Marlene felt both nervous and relieved. She stood at the back door with her cup of coffee, watching the small excavator ease its way off the trailer, its treads pressing deep into the soft earth. The workers unloaded chainsaws, shovels, pry bars, and other tools she didn't recognize. She explained the boundaries of the job again, not because she doubted them, but because she always feared misunderstandings that might lead to extra charges she couldn't afford. The crew nodded politely. They had heard this before from many homeowners, but they reassured her that everything seemed straightforward. For the first few hours, everything was. The excavator dug around the dead tree's massive roots, while another worker cut away fallen branches. The shed debris was hauled into a truck bed in large, messy pieces. The noise was constant, but not unpleasant. Progress transformed the yard little by little, revealing patches of soil that had not seen sunlight in decades. Marlene felt a quiet swell of satisfaction watching the transformation, imagining how the yard might finally become a space she wasn't ashamed of. Then, sometime near midday, something changed. She had stepped away briefly to refill her coffee when she heard the excavator's engine shift tone. It wasn't the usual grind of root tearing or the thud of earth falling. It was a sharper, hollower sound, something unnatural. Curious, she stepped back outside. The operator had stopped the machine entirely. 2 other workers hovered near the excavation pit, exchanging confused glances. At first, she didn't understand what she was looking at. The pit was deeper now than that morning, and part of the soil had collapsed inward, revealing something flat and gray under the earth. One worker jumped down with a hand shovel and scraped away at the surface. The more he cleared, the stranger it became. It was concrete, but not like the broken, uneven remnants of the shed foundation. This was smooth, uniform, with clear edges. When the worker tapped his shovel against it, the sound echoed strangely, as if there were empty space beneath. The operator climbed out of the excavator's cab, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. He said something to the other workers in a low voice. Marlene stepped closer to ask whether everything was all right, and he pointed down at the newly uncovered surface. She crouched at the edge of the pit and looked at the slab more carefully. Now that the dirt had been brushed away in some areas, she could see a faint metal seam framing part of the concrete. The structure, whatever it was, ran deeper under the yard than she could see from her angle. She felt the first tremor of unease. Foundations didn't look like that. Old septic tanks didn't either. One of the workers retrieved a long pry bar and tapped it repeatedly along the slab. The same hollow resonance came back, each strike vibrating faintly through the earth around them. The operator muttered that the slab wasn't small. Another worker moved several feet away and struck the ground again. Same sound. Another step. Same sound, only louder. Marlene's confusion deepened into a quiet, nervous dread. She didn't know much about construction, but she knew enough to recognize that large, unseen structures beneath a residential yard were rarely good news. They meant cost. they meant risk. They meant something unexpected that could upend everything she had planned, financially or otherwise. But fear gave way to curiosity as the workers decided to widen the excavation around the slab to determine its full extent. As they dug, the true shape emerged, a broad concrete roof spanning far beyond the size of any normal underground feature. And on one side, beneath a thick web of roots and packed dirt, something metallic caught the light, a corner of what appeared to be a hatch. By now, the workers were fully invested, their professional instincts awakened by the mystery. They scraped, brushed, and pulled away the compacted soil until the outline of a large, rusted metal hatch became unmistakable. It had once been painted, perhaps olive green or industrial gray, but decades underground had stripped it to a mottled mixture of rust and dull metal. Heavy hinges connected it to the concrete slab, and the faint outline of ceiling compound clung to the edges, hardened into cracked lines. Marlene felt a tightening in her chest, not from fear, but from a sudden, inexplicable awareness that her life was pivoting in a direction she could not yet see. The hatch was more than an old piece of metal. It was a threshold. Whatever lay beneath it had been hidden beneath her feet long before she had ever imagined this property could become hers. She stood silently beside the pit, the workers preparing tools to pry open the hatch. She didn't yet understand what they were about to find, nor how deeply it would unravel the quiet, predictable life she had built. But she sensed, in the same instinctive way someone senses a shift in the wind before a storm, that her backyard was not simply a neglected piece of earth. It was a sealed story, waiting to be uncovered, and she was standing at the beginning of something vast, unsettling, and irreversible. The workers positioned the pry bar beneath the heavy lid, preparing to force it open, and Marlene felt herself involuntarily hold her breath. Whatever lay beneath that slab had been waiting decades to be found. And now, for reasons she could not understand, it had chosen her moment, her life, to rise from the dark silence below. The air around the excavation pit felt strangely heavier after the discovery of the hatch, as if the ground itself held its breath while the workers prepared to pry open what had remained sealed for longer than any of them had been alive. Marlene stood close enough to see but far enough not to get in the way, her arms crossed against her chest, though she wasn't cold. The metal surface of the hatch looked ancient, forgotten, as though it had once been touched by hands that trembled with urgency or fear. The concrete slab surrounding it bore the scars of time, cracks branching out like old veins, soil packed into the fissures, roots gripping the edges as if nature had tried for decades to reclaim and bury whatever had been hidden beneath. The workers moved with the mixture of caution and excitement that came naturally when confronted with something unusual in their line of work. They discussed among themselves the best way to lift the hatch without damaging the mechanism or causing anything beneath to collapse. When they wedged the pry bar under the rusty lip of the metal door, a long, groaning creak echoed across the yard, a sound that seemed far too loud for the quiet suburban afternoon. It was not the clean metallic scrape of functioning hinges, but the strained protest of metal that had not moved in generations. Dust and flakes of rust drifted into the air as the lid lifted slowly, inch by stubborn inch, revealing a dark void beneath. As the opening widened, a wave of stale, trapped air rolled upward, brushing against their faces with the scent of closed spaces, dust, old concrete, the faintest hint of something metallic. The workers instinctively raised their hands to shield their eyes as dirt and fragments of hardened sealant crumbled loose. Marlene felt the hairs rise on the back of her neck. She couldn't see much yet. only the shadowed outline of a descending metal ladder and the pale shimmer of concrete walls descending into the earth. The men paused when the hatch finally stood fully open, propped on its ancient hinges, and, for a moment, none of them moved or spoke. The hole below seemed to stare back at them, its darkness quiet and patient, as though waiting for someone to acknowledge its presence after so many silent years. One of the workers fetched a flashlight from the toolbox and leaned cautiously over the edge, shining the beam downward. As the light cut through the darkness, it revealed a narrow shaft about 8 or 9 feet deep, with walls that were unexpectedly smooth and well constructed. A steel ladder was bolted securely to the concrete, running all the way down to a small landing at the bottom. The rungs, though coated in a layer of dull corrosion, appeared solid. Below the landing, the beam of light caught the outline of a corridor stretching beyond the visible edge. The space did not resemble a utility chamber or a septic tank. It looked intentional, designed, lived in. The workers exchanged glances again, but the operator, an older man with decades of experience, slowly nodded. He had seen many things under houses in his career, but nothing like this. He turned to Marlene and explained that someone would need to go down there to check the structural stability before anything else could be done. His voice was professional, steady, but even he couldn't hide the curiosity that had gripped the entire crew. Marlene swallowed hard and nodded, though a part of her felt strangely protective of the dark space, as if letting someone else enter it first was an act she needed to consciously permit. They prepared a rope harness, a precaution in case the air quality below was unsafe, or the ladder proved weaker than it appeared. One of the younger workers volunteered to descend first. He slipped on a mask, clipped the rope to the harness around his torso, and tested the first rung with a tentative stomp of his boot. The metal creaked but held firm. With the flashlight in hand, he began the descent, each step echoing faintly up the shaft. Marlene stood still at the edge, watching the light move down the walls as the worker disappeared gradually into the gloom. When he reached the bottom, his voice echoed upward, distorted slightly by the confined space, but clear enough for them to make out the words. He said the air was fine, the walls looked stable, and the corridor was real. Not a small chamber or a leftover utility vault, but the beginning of something much larger. He moved slowly toward the hallway, shining the flashlight ahead. The corridor was surprisingly clean for a space sealed underground for decades. The dust lay in a thin, undisturbed layer. No signs of animal intrusion, no debris, no moisture damage. It was as if the bunker had been hermetically sealed against time itself. Another worker came down, and together they gave a more detailed description of what they saw. The corridor walls were thick concrete, expertly poured and finished. Along one side, metal conduit piping ran parallel to the floor, suggesting electrical wiring once connected to some power source. Several feet ahead was a doorway, no ordinary door, but a heavy reinforced slab of steel with a large mechanical latch designed for sealing rather than simple closure. Their voices rose with a mixture of intrigue and disbelief as they relayed what they were seeing. Even without stepping inside, Marlene sensed that this was far beyond the scale of anything an average homeowner or amateur builder could have constructed on their own. After some discussion, the operator decided it was safe enough for them to explore the first room beyond the corridor entrance. He himself climbed down next, wanting to see it firsthand before making any recommendations. Marlene felt a growing pull, a mixture of fear and fascination, as she watched each worker disappear into the earth. She had never imagined her backyard contained any secrets beyond rotting wood and invasive roots, Yet now the ground had opened to reveal a structure built with purpose, hidden with care, and left to sleep beneath her home for half a century or more. The workers spent several minutes moving down the corridor, describing out loud what the flashlight beams revealed. The reinforced door was unlocked, though its latch had stiffened with age. They pushed it slowly, and the sound reverberated through the bunker like a low moan, the metallic protest echoing faintly back to the surface. The first room they entered was small but unmistakably residential. A cot rested against one wall, its metal frame intact but its fabric decayed. A small table sat in the corner, and on it lay items that instantly conjured images of solitude: old canned goods, the remnants of a cracked mug, a stack of yellowed magazines. The walls bore faint marks where posters or papers had once hung. It was the living space of someone who had prepared to stay here for a long time. When the men finally climbed back to the surface, their faces reflected a strange blend of wonder and unease. They told Marlene that the underground space wasn't just a buried room. It was an actual bunker, one built with knowledge, skill, and intention. It was large enough that they hadn't even explored all of it yet. There were more doors, more corridors. It was too soon to say how far it extended or how many rooms it contained. The construction quality was extraordinary for a residential property. The walls were thick enough to withstand significant force, the doors reinforced far beyond what an average storm shelter would require, and the fact that it had remained so well preserved, untouched by water or animals, made it even stranger. Marlene felt her mind swirl as she absorbed their words. A bunker. Under her yard. Something that had belonged to the previous owner, who had lived here alone and rarely spoken to anyone. Someone who had apparently gone to great lengths to keep this secret hidden. The thought unsettled her deeply, but she also felt an irresistible need to know more. A bunker was purpose-built, constructed for protection or survival. And if someone had built it here, meticulously and privately, there had to be a reason. The workers explained that to fully uncover the structure, they would need to remove more of the soil around the slab, widen the opening, and likely stabilize certain sections to prevent collapse during further exploration. They would need more time, and possibly more equipment. What had been estimated as a single day's project had now become something much larger. Marlene could instantly see her carefully planned budget slipping away, swallowed by the unexpected. But as she looked at the yawning opening in the earth, at the rusted hatch that had kept its secrets locked for generations, she knew she couldn't simply ignore what had been found. Whatever waited in the darkness below, it was part of her property now, part of her responsibility, and part of the strange, unwritten story of the house she had struggled so hard to make her own. The operator gave her a moment to absorb everything, then gently asked what she wanted to do next. Marlene stared into the open hatch again, the darkness no longer quite as forbidding now that she knew it led somewhere real and human. She could see the top of the metal ladder, the faint gleam of the concrete walls below, and she felt a shift inside herself, a pull toward the truth, toward the unknown, toward understanding what had been hidden beneath her feet for so long. She took a slow breath and turned to the workers. She told them to continue. She wanted to know exactly what was under her backyard. And as the men prepared to widen the excavation and bring more light into the subterranean world, Marlene felt a quiet certainty settling over her, something unlike fear. It felt instead like destiny, as though her life had been leading her, unknowingly, toward this very moment. The hatch was open now, and there was no turning back. The opening of the hatch had changed the atmosphere of the entire property. Even after the workers widened the excavation and cleared more soil around the concrete structure, the bunker felt like a presence rather than a place, something that had been waiting silently beneath Marlene's ordinary life, patient and undemanding, until the day curiosity and necessity finally uncovered it. The following morning, she woke before sunrise, unable to calm the restlessness inside her. She moved through her house in near darkness, making coffee with unfocused hands, her mind drifting repeatedly to the open pit behind her home. Every few minutes, she found herself standing by the kitchen window, staring out at the faint gray shape of the hatch. It was as if she feared it might vanish if she looked away too long, return to the earth as though it had never existed. But the workers would arrive soon, and the bunker would once again fill her thoughts for reasons far more concrete than imagination. When the crew came back, their earlier excitement had mingled with a professional seriousness. They knew now that they were dealing with a structure larger and more complex than anything a simple backyard job usually entailed. They tested their equipment, secured additional lighting, and checked the rope harnesses again. The older operator led the preparations, repeating safety guidelines while the younger workers listened more intently than they had the day before. The descent would be deeper this time, their exploration more thorough. The first room they had glimpsed, a cramped living space, was only the beginning. Marlene watched from above, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as the first worker climbed down the ladder holding a bright construction lantern. The light swung in gentle arcs as he descended, illuminating the walls in brief flashes. When he reached the corridor, he set the lantern at his feet, its glow stretching down the passage like a path guiding them into the past. The corridor seemed longer now that more of it was visible. The concrete showed no signs of water damage, no rot, no mold. It was as if someone had built it with knowledge of secrets they never intended to share and then sealed it airtight to preserve everything inside. Marlene descended next, something she had not dared to do the day before. She insisted on it, feeling a pull she could not fully explain. The workers helped her into the harness and guided her down the ladder slowly, one step at a time. When her boots hit the cold, concrete floor of the corridor, she let out a breath she had not realized she had been holding. The air smelled of age rather than decay, of dust that had settled decades ago and remained untouched. The silence was so complete it felt physical, like the weight of a blanket pressing lightly against her ears. She looked down the corridor, its walls smooth and seamless, and felt as though she were stepping into someone else's memory. They started with the first room to the right, the living quarters they had only partially explored earlier. The lantern cast steady light across the cramped space, revealing details they had missed. The metal cot, with its decayed remnants of fabric, seemed to sag under the weight of time. The table in the corner was sturdier than it appeared, its surface coated with dust but holding the ghostly outlines of items once placed upon it. Circles where cans had sat, rectangular marks where books or tools might have rested. The old magazines they had noticed before became clearer now, yellowed pages curled with age, their covers depicting dated illustrations of rockets, Cold War politics, and survival tips that reflected the fearful mindset of the era in which this bunker had likely been built. On the wall above the cot were faint rectangular patches of lighter color, suggesting that posters or documents had once been pinned there, long since removed or deteriorated. Beneath one patch, they found a few rusty tacks still embedded in the concrete. The small metal cabinet near the table creaked loudly when a worker opened it, releasing a stale puff of air. Inside were several items: a metal cup, a few cracked glass jars, dried remnants of what might have been vitamins, and an old pocket knife with a bone handle. None of the objects offered any direct answers, but together they painted a picture of someone who had prepared themselves for self-sufficiency and isolation. After documenting the first room with photos, they moved deeper into the corridor and approached the next door. This one was slightly ajar, though the hinge groaned noisily as it opened wider. The moment they stepped inside, it was clear the room served a different purpose entirely. It was a storage chamber, larger, better organized, and containing far more evidence of deliberate planning. Metal shelving units lined the walls, each stacked with an assortment of supplies. Cans of preserved food filled several of the lower shelves, their labels faded and their surfaces dented, but many remained intact. A layer of dust covered everything, yet the arrangement was meticulous, as though whoever had stocked the shelves wanted to ensure that every item would be easy to reach when needed. In one corner of the storage room stood a large wooden crate. The workers pried it open carefully, revealing a trove of hand tools wrapped in aged cloth. Hammers, wrenches, screwdrivers, a small handsaw, and a rusted lantern lay inside. The tools looked well used but carefully maintained before they were stored away. Next to the crate sat several metal cans, the type used for storing kerosene or gasoline decades earlier. They were empty now, but the faint smell of fuel still lingered around them. On a shelf above, coiled lengths of rope, folded tarps, and a heavy-duty flashlight suggested preparedness for a variety of emergencies. One shelf stood out from the others because it held equipment of a more distinctly survivalist nature. A Geiger counter with a cracked dial rested there, its once bright yellow casing dulled by time. Next to it lay a stack of folded maps, interstate routes, state boundaries, and survival field guides, sealed inside a plastic bag that had somehow protected them from rot. Their corners were crisp when the workers slid the contents out to inspect them. Marlene felt a shiver run through her. Someone had truly believed the world might end, and they had built this entire place to endure what they feared was coming. Across from the shelves of tools and maps, a second set of shelves contained items less practical, but no less haunting. There were personal trinkets, photographs of landscapes, small sculptures, a bronze medallion engraved with military insignia, and even a pocket watch with a cracked face. Everything was laid out carefully, each object nestled in its own place, as if the owner had planned to return to them regularly, to be reminded of something or someone while waiting for the unseen catastrophe to pass overhead. The next discovery came unexpectedly when one of the workers tapped absent-mindedly on the back wall of the storage room. The knock produced a hollow, almost metallic echo, distinctly different from the dense sound of solid concrete. He called the others over, and soon the entire wall was being examined carefully. It did not take long for them to find a faint, hairline seam running vertically down the center, covered by years of dust and grime. The seam marked a panel that blended almost seamlessly with the surrounding wall. Someone had gone to great lengths to disguise it. Using their tools, they removed the panel with cautious precision. It took time, but eventually it loosened from its hidden hinges and swung outward, revealing a narrow compartment just deep enough to fit a small metal box. The box itself was old but sturdy, sealed with a latch that snapped open with a reluctant pop. Inside lay a collection of items that immediately gave the impression of value: rare coins protected in small leather pouches, silver bars wrapped in cloth, and two metals polished enough to gleam softly even under the bunker's muted light. These were not merely stored items, they were treasured possessions, the kind someone would hide intentionally, separate from everyday supplies. The compartment felt like a secret inside a secret. Marlene felt the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. She stared at the coins and medals, realizing they belonged to someone who had vanished long before she bought this property. She wondered whether the previous owner had ever meant for anyone to find these things, or whether this bunker had been designed to be his final refuge, a place where he intended to spend the end of his days, whether or not the crisis he feared ever arrived. They left the storage room and continued deeper into the bunker, following the corridor until they reached another reinforced door. The latch on this door was heavier, the steel thicker, and when they pushed it open, the sound reverberated down the entire length of the corridor like a deep metallic drum. Light spilled across the threshold, revealing a room distinctly unlike the others they had explored. This space had the feeling of a workspace or study. A large table dominated the center, covered in papers that remained mostly intact due to the dry, sealed environment. Shelves lined the walls, filled with notebooks, folders, maps, and diagrams. The workers approached the table first, gently lifting a thick notebook filled with handwritten entries. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and dated. The earliest entries were from the early 1960s and referenced political events, global tensions, and the writer's growing belief that a catastrophic conflict was inevitable. Later entries became more personal, describing the construction of the bunker, the gathering of supplies, and the writer's fears of being unprepared for what was coming. Marlene listened to the workers read excerpts aloud, feeling each line tighten her heartbeat. These were not the words of a casual hobbyist. They belonged to someone consumed by the belief that survival depended on isolation and preparation. On a shelf near the back of the room, a series of blueprints and diagrams detailed the entire layout of the bunker. They showed ventilation systems, emergency exits, water storage plans, and even notes on airflow and temperature control. The bunker was not an amateur structure cobbled together in desperation. It was engineered meticulously, likely by someone with military, engineering, or survivalist training. The level of detail suggested the builder had invested immense time and resources into ensuring that this place could sustain life for an extended period. Nearby, boxes filled with correspondence offered glimpses of solitude and regret. Letters, addressed but never sent, spoke of strained relationships with relatives, of feeling isolated in the world long before retreating underground. Some pages hinted at conflicts over inheritance, legal troubles, or family tensions. Others revealed a longing for connection, a hope that someone would understand his fears. They painted the portrait of a man who had built not only a bunker, but also a life of quiet desperation beneath a world he no longer trusted. As the workers continued exploring the study, Marlene moved slowly around the room, touching the edges of the table, reading bits of notes, and feeling the profound loneliness that seemed embedded in the walls. Everything in the bunker, the supplies, the organization, the hidden compartment, the detailed plans, felt like the result of one man's attempt to survive not just a global catastrophe, but the personal unraveling of a life shaped by fear and estrangement. The discovery of the first secret compartment had been surprising, but something in the structure of the bunker made Marlene feel certain that there was more. More secrets, more hidden chambers, more clues left behind by the builder. The workers seemed to sense the same thing. They examined the floors and walls more thoroughly, feeling for irregularities, tapping for hollow sounds. And then, on the far wall of the study, behind a row of shelves filled with documents, one of the workers identified a section of the concrete that seemed too thick, too reinforced, and too intentionally concealed to be ordinary structural support. Something was behind it, something important. As they tested the wall, Marlene felt an unease begin to rise inside her. She didn't yet know what awaited behind this barrier, but the bunker had already revealed enough to change her understanding of the house she lived in and the man who had once owned it. And still, the deepest truth of the bunker, the truth that would turn her life inside out, was only just beginning to surface beneath the concrete walls and decades of silence. The study room lingered in Marlene's mind long after they stepped out of it. The scent of old paper, the soft crackle of dust under their boots, the feeling of standing inside the mind of a man long gone. These impressions clung to her like the faint echo of a whispered confession. She could still see the worker's flashlight gliding across the handwritten diary pages, illuminating the fears and obsessions of someone who had lived half his life anticipating catastrophe. It felt as though she had trespassed into a part of history that had never been meant for anyone else to read. And yet, she could not deny that something in the bunker called to her with an insistence she could neither explain nor ignore. When the workers returned their focus to the thick section of wall at the back of the study, Marlene followed them closely, driven by both dread and anticipation. The previous discovery of the hidden compartment, filled with silver bars, coins, and medals, had unsettled her deeply. Those items had been hidden with purpose. But this section of wall felt different. It was too deliberate, too calculated in its construction. It did not appear simply reinforced, but concealed, as though someone had wanted to bury more than objects. Perhaps they had wanted to bury something they feared would be taken, or perhaps something they could not leave in plain sight. The workers began by brushing away dust and debris to better examine the surface. With the layer of grime removed, the outline of a concealed hatch or door became more apparent. It was not obvious at first glance. The concrete covering had been meticulously applied to blend seamlessly with the rest of the wall, but the subtle irregularity of the texture, the faint difference in how sound echoed when tapped, made it undeniable. This was a disguised entryway, and it was likely the most important one in the bunker. The operator, who had taken the lead on all major decisions due to his years of experience, surveyed the outline with a grave expression. The hidden section was large, perhaps too large to be just another storage nook. The thickness suggested that whatever lay beyond it had been protected with unusual determination. He instructed the younger workers to carefully chip away the outer layer of concrete. It was slow, meticulous work, noisy enough to fill the bunker with sharp echoes that ricocheted through the corridor and made the confined space vibrate faintly with each strike. Marlene watched anxiously as the first thin crack appeared in the surface, revealing a glint of metal beneath. It took nearly an hour to clear enough of the facade to expose what lay underneath. A solid steel hatch reinforced with thick riveted plates, the kind she had only ever seen in documentaries about military installations or naval ships. Its central locking mechanism was simple yet imposing. A large horizontal bar secured by heavy pins, now seized with rust. One of the workers approached her and murmured that this hatch likely concealed something of utmost importance. It was overkill for personal storage and unnecessary for ordinary living space. People who built shelters in their backyards, even during the height of Cold War paranoia, rarely went to such lengths unless they were protecting something irreplaceable. The thought sent a chill through her. She wondered if the previous owner had stored weapons, contraband, dangerous materials, or something far more personal. When the workers finally loosened the locking bar and pried it free, the hatch let out a deep groan, vibrating through the floor beneath their feet. Dust cascaded in small clouds, and the scent of old metal intensified. The door swung slowly inward, revealing a narrow set of 3 descending steps that led into a chamber deeper than the rooms they had explored so far. The lanterns were brought closer, their beams reaching into the gloom until shapes gradually took form. The chamber was smaller than she expected, roughly the size of a modest storage room, but its contents were arranged with ceremonial precision. It felt less like a bunker room and more like a vault, private, solemn, untouched. The air inside was cooler, preserved in a way that made time seem suspended. On the floor, arranged neatly in 2 rows, stood 5 large metal trunks, each thick-walled and sealed. Their surfaces bore a dull gray sheen, free from excessive rust, likely due to being kept in an environment carefully protected from moisture. The workers approached cautiously, examining the trunks as if they were relics from an archaeological dig. The first trunk they attempted to open resisted stubbornly, its lock stiff and corroded, but after several attempts they managed to break the seal. As the lid creaked open, Marlene found herself stepping forward involuntarily, drawn toward the trunk despite the fear tying her stomach into knots. Inside, illuminated by the soft glow of the lantern, lay stacks of paper bills bundled tightly and arranged with meticulous care. The bills were old but shockingly well preserved, their edges crisp, their colors faded only slightly. They bore designs from decades past, vintage currency that looked almost alien compared to modern money. Some bundles were labeled with dates written in careful handwriting. Others were sealed in waxed paper, their denominations hidden. The amount in that first trunk alone could have altered the course of her entire life. The second trunk was filled with something heavier. When the workers opened it, the lantern light caught the unmistakable shine of gold. Neatly stacked bars, each stamped with official markings, filled the interior in quiet, gleaming rows. Some bars bore dates from the 1930s and 1940s. Others were unmarked, perhaps purchased privately or acquired through means she could not guess. The weight of them felt immense, not only physically but symbolically. They represented the unspoken fears of the man who had locked them beneath this house, the fears that had driven him to build this bunker and protect it with such devotion. The third trunk contained smaller, carefully wrapped bundles. Coins encased in plastic, rare currency, documents, jewelry boxes containing items crafted long before her time. Rings, bracelets, and watches gleamed faintly in the lantern light, some with gemstones that shimmered even under the dust. One piece in particular, a pocket watch engraved with delicate filigree, seemed to draw everyone's attention. Its cover bore initials intricately etched into the metal, initials that matched those found in the diary upstairs. It was a personal item, something that must have belonged to the bunker's owner or his family before everything had driven him underground. But the fourth trunk held something entirely different, something that shifted the entire tone of the discovery. Inside were bundles of papers carefully stored in envelopes and folders, sealed to avoid moisture. These documents seemed to include investment certificates, property deeds, bonds, and bank statements from decades earlier. Some had newspaper clippings attached to them cross-referenced with handwritten notes. There were also notebooks filled with detailed accounts of his financial dealings, inventories of items he had stored in the bunker, and letters written but never sent. One letter stood out among the rest, not because of its condition, but because of the words scrawled on the envelope, "For the person who finds this after I'm gone." Marlene felt her breath catch when a worker handed the envelope to her. She opened it slowly, her hands trembling, aware that she was about to step into a stranger's thoughts in a way few people ever did. The letter inside was long and written in the same careful script as the diaries. She read the words silently, each line drawing her deeper into the emotional landscape of a man she had never met. He wrote about isolation, not the kind imposed by circumstance, but the kind born from feeling misunderstood, untrusted, and unloved by those who shared his blood. He wrote about his fear of war, of political turmoil, of a future shaped by chaos, but he also wrote about his disappointment in people. His family, he claimed, had turned their backs on him in his time of need, leaving him to fend for himself. In response, he had chosen to leave his legacy not to them, but to whomever might one day uncover his secret refuge. He hoped that person would be someone who needed a chance, someone who would treat what he left behind with care, not greed. He did not believe his relatives deserved it. By the time she finished reading, Marlene's hands felt weak, as though the letter had drained something from her. The workers around her remained respectfully silent. They could not hear the words she had read, but they saw the shift in her posture, the trembling in her breath, the sudden heaviness in her eyes. The discovery of the fifth trunk would only deepen that heaviness. When they opened it, they found something more intimate than gold or currency. Inside were personal items, journals written during his final years, photographs of people he had loved, mementos from his travels, letters he had received but kept sealed. One box contained objects wrapped in cloth, fragments of someone's past, preserved as though they held the last pieces of a life that had quietly unraveled. There was a lock of hair tied with a ribbon, a child's drawing faded by time, a medal awarded for service in the armed forces. These artifacts painted a picture not just of paranoia or survivalism, but of longing, loneliness, and a desperate desire to hold on to the pieces of a world that had once mattered to him. The chamber was silent as Marlene stood amid the open trunks, surrounded by the remnants of a life lived in fear, hope, and secrecy. She felt an overwhelming mix of emotions, astonishment, sorrow, disbelief, and something deeper, something almost like gratitude. She understood now that the bunker was not simply an emergency shelter or a collection of hoarded treasures. It was the culmination of a man's struggle against both the world and his own heart. Everything he had locked away had been meant to protect him from a life he believed too harsh to face. And when he died, all of it had remained entombed beneath her backyard, waiting for someone who might understand. She knew the discovery would change everything. The money, the gold, the documents, they represented more than mere wealth. They were a lifeline, a possibility, a transformation waiting to unfold. But they were also a burden, one that brought with it questions about legality, morality, and the weight of inheriting a stranger's final wish. As she stepped back from the trunks, she felt the full gravity of the moment settle over her. The bunker had revealed its greatest secret, and now the world outside, her world, would never be the same. For a long while after the discovery of the underground chamber, Marlene stood among the open trunks in silence. The soft glow of the lanterns flickered across the contents of the vault, reflecting off the gold bars and glinting faintly across the aged envelopes, the carefully stacked bills, the jewelry that had once meant everything to a man who had died alone. The air felt different in the chamber, heavier and laden with history, as if every breath she drew carried with it the weight of someone else's lifetime. When she finally climbed the ladder back to the surface, the late afternoon sun felt almost unreal after so many hours in the dim world beneath her feet. The warmth on her skin reminded her that she still lived in a world where responsibility, fear, and consequence waited with the persistence of gravity. The discoveries were extraordinary, but they were not simple. The moment her boots touched the grass again, she understood instinctively that what had been unearthed would not remain theirs alone for long. The workers packed up their tools in an unusual quiet. Even the chatty young assistant, who normally filled the air with commentary, seemed too stunned to speak. They exchanged glances with one another, some excited, some wary, some simply exhausted by the magnitude of what they had found. The operator, the most experienced among them, approached Marlene with a slow, deliberate step. He removed his hard hat and rubbed the back of his neck before he spoke, as though trying to find words that would not alarm, yet would prepare her for what was unavoidable. He told her that they had uncovered something far beyond the scope of a routine job, something that would likely draw attention from authorities, historians, collectors, and most troubling of all, anyone who might have a claim of relation to the deceased owner. The thought unsettled her deeply. She felt as though she stood on the edge of a cliff that she had not seen coming, and behind her the ground had already begun to crumble. Still, she thanked the workers quietly, her voice carrying both gratitude and anxious uncertainty. They promised to return the next day to secure the opening and help her plan the next steps. But even after they left, their trucks rumbling up the street, the sound fading into the hum of the neighborhood, the unease remained. She stood at the edge of the excavation pit long after the sun dipped low behind the houses, staring at the open hatch as dusk settled on the yard. For a moment, she imagined the previous owner standing in her place decades ago, looking down into the same darkness he had built to protect himself. She wondered if he had ever imagined that someone else would find it, that someone like her, an ordinary woman with ordinary struggles, would become the inheritor of his secret world. That night, Marlene barely slept. Thoughts churned through her mind with relentless force. She imagined the wonders they had discovered, but also the complications. Wealth like that did not come without strings, or expectations, or claims. By early morning, her fear proved warranted. She woke to the sound of a knock at her door, sharp and insistent. When she opened it, she found two men from the local fire department, accompanied by a county safety inspector. Someone, they explained, had reported an unpermitted excavation on her property, most likely one of the neighbors who had seen the workers and the exposed concrete slab. They insisted on seeing the site. Marlene, her pulse racing, led them reluctantly through the house to the backyard. Once they reached the pit, the men examined the scene with concerned expressions. The inspector asked her what exactly the crew had found. She hesitated for a moment, knowing that the truth, once spoken, would spread like wildfire, but lying would only bring more trouble. She explained, cautiously, that they had uncovered what appeared to be an abandoned underground structure built by the previous homeowner. She deliberately avoided mentioning the trunks, the gold, or the hidden documents. Still, the inspector's eyebrows shot up at the word underground. He muttered about permits, safety hazards, liability, and potential legal obligations. Though he did not force his way into the bunker, he warned her that officials might need to evaluate the structure. It might be designated a hazard. It might even be deemed historically significant. By the time the men left, Marlene felt as though she were suffocating. Her yard no longer felt like her own. It had become a spotlight under which she stood exposed and unprepared. She tried to gather her thoughts, to steady herself before her son woke, but even as she attempted to calm her breathing, her phone buzzed with a notification. Then another, and another. At first, she ignored them, assuming they were promotional messages or updates she hadn't turned off. But when she finally glanced at the screen, her heart sank. The local news station had posted an article titled, "Massive Underground Structure Found Beneath Private Home." The accompanying photo was a grainy picture of her backyard taken from over the fence, likely by one of the very neighbors she had waved to politely for years. Within an hour, several reporters appeared on her street. They parked haphazardly along the curb and approached her house with cameras in hand, calling out questions before they even reached her driveway. Marlene froze at the window, unable to process how quickly everything was unfolding. She could hear their voices through the glass, asking what she had found, how large the bunker was, whether there were valuables inside, how old the structure might be, whether she had contacted the authorities, and whether she intended to open it to the public. The sudden assault of attention felt like a punch to her chest. She stepped back from the window, trembling, and locked the door. Her son, confused and frightened, asked what was happening outside. She told him not to worry and to stay away from the windows, but her voice betrayed her, shaking with every word. She called the operator first, hoping he might offer guidance. He answered in a low tone, warning her that once the news spread, she would face more than reporters. He had seen cases like this before, though not on such a scale. People who claimed to be related to the deceased would appear. Neighbors might argue about property boundaries. The county might try to intervene, asserting that the bunker was of public interest. She needed legal representation, he said gently. She needed protection. By midday, her fears materialized in full. A pair of middle-aged siblings, a man and woman, approached her house with determined strides. They introduced themselves as distant relatives of the former homeowner, insisting that they had every right to access the bunker. Their grandfather, they claimed, had been the original owner before it was passed down and eventually sold. They said they had heard about the discovery on the news and demanded information. Their posture was defensive, their tone accusatory, as though Marlene had personally tried to steal their inheritance. When Marlene told them politely that they needed to leave her property, the woman's face twisted with anger. She accused Marlene of hiding something, of digging without proper notice, of trespassing against the rights of the deceased. The man, more controlled but equally calculating, asked whether anything of value had been found. Marlene, shaken, repeated only that an old underground shelter had been uncovered and that she was still trying to understand the situation herself. The encounter lasted only minutes, but when the siblings finally left, they did so with a promise that their attorney would be in touch. True to their word, the next day, Marlene received a formal letter from a law firm representing multiple extended relatives of the former owner. The letter claimed that any valuables found on the property belonged to the estate of the deceased and must be relinquished immediately. They argued that the bunker, while physically on her land, was a structure built by their family member, and thus any contents legally belonged to his heirs. They demanded access, documentation, and a halt to any removal or disturbance of items. The pressure only escalated. Neighbors who had rarely spoken to her before now approached with forced friendliness or veiled curiosity. Some feigned concern for her safety, while others asked pointed questions about what she planned to do with the treasure. A few hinted that part of the bunker might extend under their property line, suggesting they too might have a claim. The swarm of reporters intensified. Their vans lined the street, their lenses trained on her front door in hopes of capturing her reaction. Private messages flooded her phone from strangers online, offering advice, threats, congratulations, or demands for transparency. Marlene felt as though the world had burst into her life with the force of a storm. Every moment she spent awake was drenched in anxiety. She feared going outside, speaking to anyone, answering her phone, or even taking out the trash. Her hands shook constantly. She could hardly focus at work, her mind drifting endlessly back to the letter she had found in the bunker, the one written by the man who had built it. He had described his loneliness, the betrayal he felt from his own family, his absolute insistence that they should never inherit the fruits of his labor. He had built the bunker not only out of fear of war, but out of fear of them. Late one night, after her son had fallen asleep, Marlene sat at her dining table with the letter laid out in front of her. The words felt heavier now than when she had first read them underground. The former owner had not merely hidden valuables, he had hidden his last will, his final plea to the unknown person who would one day discover his sanctuary. He had written that he wanted the contents of the bunker to go to someone who truly needed them, someone who would treasure them not as symbols of wealth but as lifelines. He had written that the people who shared his blood had already abandoned him. He did not want them rewarded for their neglect. With her shaken hands pressed to her temples, Marlene realized that the diary entries and the letter were more than personal writings. They were testimony. They expressed intent, clarity of mind, and purpose. They would matter in court. The man had not trusted his family, and now they were proving his fears justified by trying to seize what he had spent a lifetime protecting. But even knowing this, the uncertainty of the legal battle terrified her. She could not afford costly litigation. She could not outmatch well-funded relatives. She feared losing everything, not only the bunker's contents, but her home, her privacy, her peace. She feared what the world would do to her and her son if they remained at the center of this storm. It was at her lowest moment, overwhelmed and trembling, that she remembered the advice of the operator and finally picked up the phone to call an attorney. The woman she spoke to listened carefully, asked precise questions, and assured her that she had handled complicated inheritance cases before. She suggested meeting in person, promising to review the documents Marlene had found. For the first time in days, Marlene felt a faint thread of hope tugging at her heart. When the attorney finally sat in Marlene's living room examining the bunker diaries and the letter addressed to the finder, her eyes narrowed in concentration. She traced her fingers across the neat handwriting, nodding slowly as she read. Then she looked up and met Marlene's anxious gaze. In her expression, Marlene saw something she had not seen in days: confidence. The attorney explained that while handwritten documents were not traditional wills, they could serve as evidence of intent, especially when written clearly and stored securely. She explained that property law was intricate but not insurmountable, and that the relatives' claims were far from guaranteed. She assured Marlene that the bunker being on her land gave her significant legal standing. But what gave her the strongest leverage of all was the letter. The explicit statement that the owner did not want his relatives to inherit what he had hidden, combined with his reasoning, could be considered a form of last testament under certain jurisdictions. It would not be a simple battle, but it was far from hopeless. For the first time since the discovery, Marlene's lungs felt capable of holding a full breath. She still feared the future, still dreaded the court hearings, still trembled at the thought of facing hostile relatives in front of cameras. But she also felt the spark of something stronger than fear. She felt the beginning of resolve. Yet the storm outside her home had only intensified. Reporters continued to lurk in her neighborhood. Neighbors continued to whisper. Lawyers continued to send letters. The relatives who claimed ownership grew louder and more aggressive, threatening to involve state officials and historical preservation boards. They argued that the bunker belonged to history, not to a woman who had simply purchased the land by chance. The tension seeped into every part of Marlene's life. At work, she noticed disapproving glances and overheard conversations trailing off the moment she entered a room. Parents, picking up their children, whispered among themselves, wondering aloud whether she was sitting on a fortune. Her son came home upset one afternoon after classmates teased him, claiming he was now the rich kid, accusing him of stealing someone else's property. Marlene hugged him until his sobs quieted, guilt piercing her heart like a needle. She had never wanted any of this. All she had ever wanted was a safe home and a chance at stability. But now, fate had placed something extraordinary in her hands, and the world was determined to rip it away. Even as she tried to hold her life together, the attorney worked tirelessly. She collected documents, requested permits, filed motions to prevent the relatives from accessing the bunker without Marlene's consent, and prepared a detailed argument highlighting the previous owner's clear intent. She took copies of the diaries and photographed the bunker meticulously, planning to use the emotional weight of his words as evidence. And, as the case grew, the attorney uncovered a crucial detail, a piece of information buried in the diaries that shifted everything. In one entry, the previous owner recounted a confrontation with his only surviving sibling, who he claimed had attempted to sue him for control over family assets. He wrote that after that day, he no longer considered any blood relative trustworthy. He wrote that if he died with his bunker sealed, that would be his final judgment, leaving his hidden wealth in the hands of whoever the future delivered. This was more than bitterness. It was intent. When Marlene learned this, she felt something deep inside her shift. She still feared the storm, but now she felt better prepared to endure it. She felt the support of a ghost whose voice had reached across decades to defend her right to claim what she had found. The bunker was no longer simply a hidden refuge. It had become the battlefield of a silent inheritance war, and she had been chosen, not by fate or greed, but by the very man who had built it. The weeks that followed were an exhausting blur of interviews, legal meetings, court filings, and emotional strain. Marlene often stood by the open excavation at twilight, staring down at the hatch as though seeking answers from the darkness. She thought of the former owner often, his loneliness, his fear, his longing for connection. She wondered whether he would have approved of her, whether he would have felt comfort knowing that the person who discovered his secret was someone who needed it more than anyone could have imagined. As the neighbors watched and the reporters circled, as the relatives sharpened their claims and the attorney strengthened her defense, Marlene realized that the bunker had brought not only wealth into her life, but a trial she would have to face head-on. And yet, despite her fear, she sensed something else stirring within her, a quiet resolve that would soon shape the outcome of everything. The discovery that had begun as an accident during a simple backyard renovation had become the defining moment of her life. But she did not yet realize that the storm she faced was nearing its peak, and when it finally broke, the truth would shine through with a clarity that would change everything she believed about destiny, justice, and the strange, powerful legacy of the man who had hidden his fortune beneath her feet. The tension that had gripped Marlene's life reached its sharpest point in the weeks that followed the relatives' legal threats and the arrival of reporters on her quiet street. It felt as though every hour brought a new intrusion, another demand letter, another stranger photographing her house from across the street, another whispered rumor at work, another sleepless night spent wondering if the discovery beneath her backyard would ultimately destroy the stability she had fought so hard to build. Yet, through all of it, the attorney she had hired worked relentlessly, piecing together a defense not only of Marlene's rights as a homeowner, but of the unspoken wishes of a man who had died decades before she ever set foot on the property. Her days at school became a blur. She fulfilled her duties mechanically, her mind never fully present. Sometimes she would pause in the middle of filing papers or answering calls, momentarily forgetting what she was doing as worry pressed against her temples. The school principal, a kind but cautious woman, called her into the office one day and expressed concern about the media attention. She said gently that the school preferred not to be associated with controversial situations and asked Marlene to be discreet in her interactions. Marlene nodded, apologizing, although she had done nothing wrong. It only deepened her sense that the bunker's discovery had pulled her entire life off its axis, leaving her unmoored and constantly on the defensive. The county then officially intervened. A letter arrived informing Marlene that the bunker might need to be examined by safety engineers, citing concerns about potential structural hazards or code violations. The attorney responded swiftly, restricting access and arguing that the county could not simply claim oversight based on speculation. But the pressure mounted. Marlene felt surrounded on all sides, by governmental authority, by opportunistic relatives, by public curiosity, and by the crushing weight of uncertainty. Yet, beneath the chaos, a single thread of hope remained, the letter written by the bunker's owner. Every time anxiety overwhelmed her, she returned to the man's careful handwriting, the admission of loneliness, the acknowledgement of betrayal, and the explicit declaration that he wanted his hidden legacy to go to someone who truly needed it. The more she reread it, the more she felt the man's presence, not as a ghost haunting her, but as a voice guiding her through the storm. She imagined him writing those words alone in that underground chamber, perhaps sensing that they might one day give someone the courage he had never found in life. The first court hearing arrived sooner than expected. Marlene entered the courthouse with trembling hands, her son sitting with a neighbor she trusted, her attorney walking beside her with a composed confidence that Marlene wished she could borrow. The relatives, 4 of them now, from different branches of the original family, sat in a row across the aisle, each accompanied by stern-faced legal representatives. They glared at her as though she were a thief trying to steal their birthright. But Marlene kept her gaze forward, repeating her attorney's words silently. "You are not the intruder here. You are the lawful owner of the property, and most importantly, you are the one he chose." The courtroom felt cold and unfriendly. The judge presiding over the case listened intently as the relatives' attorneys presented their arguments. They claimed that the bunker had been built with funds belonging to their ancestor, that all valuables found within it formed part of his estate, and that as legal heirs they had every right to them. They pointed to historical records of the previous owner's family, property deeds from decades prior, and witness statements from people who vaguely remembered the family's tensions. They argued that regardless of where the bunker was physically located, the items inside were misplaced inheritance, inadvertently passed to the wrong hands. When it was the attorney's turn to speak on Marlene's behalf, She approached the bench with a calm that silenced the courtroom. She explained, with patience and precision, the legal significance of finding private property on land owned by someone else. She outlined the rights of the homeowner, the historical context of the bunker's construction, and the absence of any formal will naming the relatives as beneficiaries. Then she revealed the diaries. The courtroom stirred as she described the detailed entries, the references to bitter severance from family, the account of failed relationships, and the deep sense of betrayal that seemed to permeate every page. Finally, she presented the letter, the one addressed to the person who finds this. The judge asked to see it. Marlene watched with bated breath as the letter was handed over, the old paper trembling slightly in the judge's hands. He read silently for a long moment. The room remained utterly still. Even the relatives quieted, their smug expressions faltering when they saw the judge's brow furrow and his eyes narrow at certain lines. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. He asked the relatives' attorneys whether they had any evidence contradicting the former owner's stated wishes. They attempted to argue that the letter was not legally binding, that it had no official witnesses, and that the deceased man might not have been mentally sound. But the attorney countered immediately. The diaries demonstrated consistent, rational thought. The bunker's construction showed long-term planning, and nothing indicated mental incapacity. She emphasized that while handwritten instructions were not a traditional will, they could be considered a legitimate expression of intent when clearly articulated and preserved. The judge adjourned the case to review the evidence thoroughly. Marlene left the courthouse drained, her entire body heavy with anticipation and fear. For 3 days she lived in suspended uncertainty, unable to sleep, her mind chasing every possible outcome. She imagined losing everything, being forced to surrender the bunker's contents, facing ridicule from neighbors and strangers alike. She imagined the financial ruin of legal fees she could not pay. She imagined packing up her house, her son's belongings, and leaving the street in shame. But on the 4th day, the court called them back. The courtroom felt different this time, tense, charged. Marlene's attorney squeezed her hand gently before the judge entered. When he took his seat, he looked over the documents one last time before speaking. His voice was steady and solemn, carrying the weight of finality. He acknowledged the relatives' arguments and their emotional stake in the matter. He recognized the unusual nature of the bunker and the extraordinary contents hidden within it. But then he shifted focus. He cited the principle of property rights. The bunker, sealed and forgotten, had become part of the land passed legally to Marlene. He emphasized the clarity of the former owner's writings, his expressed wishes, and the evident estrangement from his family. He referenced state statutes that allowed handwritten directives to be considered legally significant if they demonstrated clear intent. Then, with a firm tone that brooked no ambiguity, he ruled that the contents of the bunker rightfully belonged to Marlene. The courtroom erupted in a wave of reactions, outrage from the relatives, murmurs from observers, a gasp from someone in the back row. Marlene, overwhelmed, covered her mouth with her hands. She felt her eyes sting with tears she could not stop. It was not triumph she felt. It was relief, deep, trembling relief. Her attorney placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, whispering that it was over, that she had won, that she could finally breathe again. The relatives stormed out, some shouting warnings of appeals, others simply shaking their heads as though unable to accept defeat. But even if appeals followed, The court's ruling stood on solid ground. Marlene walked out of the courthouse with her attorney, her knees weak, her heart pounding. Outside, reporters pressed forward with microphones and rapid questions, but Marlene, shielded by her attorney, declined to comment. For the first time in weeks, she did not feel afraid. She felt grounded again in the life that had been slipping through her fingers. In the days that followed, the storm gradually began to subside. The reporters eventually left, finding new stories to chase. Neighbors quieted their curiosity once they realized they had no legal avenue to intrude. Even the relatives' threats of appeal grew weaker as their attorneys acknowledged privately that the judge's decision was likely to withstand further challenge. For the first time since the excavation began, Marlene felt the house settle around her like a protective shell rather than a cage under siege. She spent long evenings thinking about what to do with the contents of the bunker. Her attorney advised caution, warning her that sudden displays of wealth might invite renewed scrutiny. So Marlene moved carefully. She contacted reputable appraisers to document the gold bars and vintage currency. She sold a small portion discreetly through proper channels, enough to pay off her mortgage, eliminate her debts, and establish a secure savings fund. She set aside money for her son's education, ensuring he would never face the same financial barriers she had. She reinvested part of it into the house, repairing the roof, updating the wiring, replacing the old windows. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future not defined by survival, but by possibility. She also felt compelled to honor the man whose fear had created the bunker and whose final wish had rescued her from a life of constant struggle. She kept several of his personal items, the pocket watch, a few photographs, the handwritten diaries. They felt like artifacts of a man who had spent his life in the shadows, misunderstood and perhaps mistreated, and yet whose last act had been an offering of hope to a stranger. She created a small display in one of the bunker rooms, arranging his belongings carefully, cleaning the surfaces, restoring the space with dignity. It was her way of acknowledging the path he had carved that led unexpectedly into her own, and yet she did not turn the bunker into a museum. She kept most of it private, a protected part of her home that only a trusted few were allowed to enter. She sealed the main chamber securely, installed proper ventilation and lighting, and ensured that the structural integrity was preserved. She wanted it to remain intact, not as a curiosity for the world, but as a tribute to the man who built it. Months passed. The neighborhood returned to its usual rhythms. The noise of children playing in driveways replaced the murmurs of scandal. The smell of fresh-cut grass replaced the scent of excavated earth. Marlene's son resumed his carefree behavior, relieved to no longer be the focus of attention. And gradually, Marlene herself began to feel the quiet peace she had once believed was impossible. On a mild autumn evening, as a golden light stretched across the yard, Marlene descended into the bunker alone. She walked through the corridor, her footsteps echoing softly off the concrete walls, and entered the study where the diary still rested neatly on the table. She ran her fingers over the worn covers, remembering the fear in the man's handwriting, the longing, the regret. Then she sat down in his old chair, the one he had probably used while planning every detail of the bunker's construction, and opened her own notebook. She wrote about the months that had passed, about the fear, the legal battles, the threats, and the victory. She wrote about the man who had built the bunker, imagining the intention behind his every decision. She wrote about her son's future, the opportunities now within reach, the education he would receive, the home she could maintain without fear of foreclosure. She wrote about gratitude, not the shallow gratitude of polite obligation, but the deep, humbling gratitude of someone who had been given a lifeline when she needed it most. When she finished writing, she closed the notebook gently and looked around the bunker with new understanding. The place that had been born from fear had become a place of empowerment. The vault that had once been a refuge against the end of the world had become the foundation of a new beginning for her and her son. The man who had lived in isolation had unknowingly changed their lives in a way neither time nor circumstance could erase. As she climbed the ladder back into the fading evening light, Marlene felt the weight of the bunker settle peacefully behind her. It no longer felt like a secret threatening to unravel her world, but a legacy entrusted to her with purpose. And she would carry that purpose forward, not in fear, but in hope. If you want more stories like this, hit subscribe right now. Don't miss the next videos. They're already on the way. And share this one with someone who needs to see it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from.